Hello citizens and welcome back. In today's video I want to talk about the recent Pyro playtest, how it went and what issues with the game it showed us. As always, if you like this video, sacrifice a like and a comment to the YouTube algorithm and subscribe for more. And here's a shout out to our amazing patrons for their support of the channel and the Armory. First of all, let's talk about what is Pyro. Pyro is a system that neighbors Stanton. It used to be a lucrative mining system, but now most of the materials present were exhausted. This, combined with an unstable star that regularly unleashes solo flares onto the whole system, the mining effort was abandoned. This left a void which was swiftly filled by gangs and various organizations that operate outside of UEE laws. And that statement should immediately highlight how incredibly dangerous Pyro is. This also brings further issues, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But despite the constant solo flares and dangerous gangs roaming around, there are many settlements across Pyro offering missions, trading opportunities, and possible combat. Now, just because there's no UEE to enforce the laws that we know from Stanton doesn't mean that there aren't any laws at all. The various gangs and factions in Pyro have some interest in keeping order and preventing too much violence and crime, since they depend on the population of the system to produce goods or provide services. However, that doesn't mean that most NPCs or players you meet in Pyro won't shoot first and ask questions later. And while technically PvP combat is supposed to be a normal occurrence in Pyro, it did highlight some major issues with the game as a whole. Now, I want to preface this by saying that I am not anti-PvP. Star Citizen is a PvP game and always will be. But there are some aspects of the game at the moment that tend to make PvP one-sided and sometimes detrimental to the game at large. We saw many instances of players or groups of players locking down certain locations, killing all the NPCs and all the players trying to get there to do stuff. Now, this inherently is not bad. It's actually even expected during certain events and at certain locations like Jumptown. And generally, if you arrive at the location of your mission, and you see a bunch of hostile ships and you don't want to fight them, you have the option to leave and come back later. This is currently somewhat limited by persistence though. Let's say you have a delivery mission that takes you to an outpost. You arrive and discover that a group of players is shooting at anyone who tries to land. It's reasonable to assume that they will be there until someone removes them by force, and even then there is no guarantee they won't come back. You are now left with the option to fight and likely lose or abandon your mission. Once missions persist through sessions, this won't be as much of a problem. However, during the Pyro playtest, we saw players preventing other players from leaving the spawn locations or locking down outposts for no reason other than to kill people. Such players are commonly labeled as murder hobos or griefers. And while what they do is annoying, it doesn't meet CIG's definition of griefing. This is mostly because there are and there will be mechanisms to prevent murder hobo behavior. So let's take a look at what those are. Currently, the official stance of CIG is that they prefer a PvP solution to anything else. This means that they want players to group together and defeat the bad actors. And while I have seen it happen, it rarely works and generally it is not cost effective to the group trying to clear the location. Now, why is that? Well, generally it's pretty rare for random players to form a group to fight other players, at least in my experience. You could bring in your org, but why waste org resources fighting people holding an outpost that has no strategic value other than that you want to deliver a box? Also, in the case of camping spawn locations, you might not even be able to take off to meet the attackers in combat. The other problem is that for a successful assault, you need to have more people on your side or more skill, which generally also doesn't happen. But arguably that's a skill issue. Also, technically by trying to fight, you are enabling the murder hobo behavior, and generally you will lose a lot of time and resources with minimal gain, with the notable exception of Jumptown and similar events. But moving on to the technical issues, most locations in the verse are painfully easy to take and hold even in lawful areas in Stanton. You would expect stations serving as gang strongholds in Pyro to have formidable defenses, making it nearly impossible for a small group to prevent anyone from taking off. In theory, improving the defenses of critical locations actually helps the PvP solution, because it tilts the advantage towards the defenders or people trying to clear the location. The second major problem is consequences. Currently, there are no consequences to murder hobo behavior in lawless systems and very little consequences in lawful systems. You do gain a crime stat, which will prevent you from accessing certain locations, but generally doesn't hinder you from doing most things in the game. And it doesn't discourage the behavior, and it can be easily removed. It does mean that bounty hunters might come after you, but that's just more fuel to the murder hobo fire. So what's the solution? It would be the long-term reputation system. In lawful systems, this would essentially place a permanent crime stat on people breaking the law repeatedly. It gets a bit more complicated in lawless systems though. Since there is no central authority, you can't place permanent crime stat on a player. But it's safe to assume that if you attack people around facilities controlled by a certain faction, that faction will become increasingly hostile towards you. This would eventually provoke immediate hostile action if you run into that faction. While this won't prevent camping points of interest, combined with powerful defenses, it might make camping spawn points a lot more difficult. I also heard an interesting idea that the reputation of an individual would also affect the reputation of their organizations. Which sounds interesting, but not sure quite how that would work. Especially for large orgs, this would mean that all the members would have good reputation with many factions without ever interacting with them. So, will reputation fix the murder hobo problem? Probably not, but eventually once logistics become more important in Star Citizen, they will have a much harder time to exist. What does that mean? Well, imagine that you are a would-be murder hobo that just started the game with a neutral reputation. You can go pretty much anywhere you like, and you will likely be provided services like fuel, repair, and access to stations and landing zones. Let's say you pick a system in the UEE to start, for example Terra. You kill a few NPCs and players and eventually get caught and sent to prison. Upon release, your reputation has worsened. You are now supposed to be a reformed criminal, so some mission givers might be reluctant to communicate with you until you repair your reputation. On the other hand, other unlawful mission givers might start getting interested. Of course, it might take a few more prison sentences to achieve this depending on how CAG balance it. But you go and again kill a few players and NPCs in this lawful system. Maybe this time it takes longer to get caught, so you manage to rack up quite a few charges before you're caught. This time you're a repeat offender, so your sentence is much longer. But maybe you mine your way out or even escape this time. But now your reputation has taken quite a hit, so very few mission givers in the lawful system will want to interact with you, and some areas might even refuse you entry. This cuts off your access to supplies and your income. Now, why would you care about supplies or income? You still need fuel, repairs, food, and medical attention, and you need to pay for it somehow. So eventually this forces you to go to a slightly less lawful system like Stanton. You again have access to a source of income, and there are locations that will let you access their services despite your reputation. But you once again kill some players and NPCs, and maybe this time you don't get caught, because you can just hide at Grimhex indefinitely and avoid bounty hunters. But of course you continue killing players and NPCs, and eventually you aren't welcome even at Grimhex. So you move over to Pyro, where the local gangs probably won't mind your presence. But as you go around killing people and disrupting their operations, even they will eventually try to get rid of you or refuse to provide services. Eventually, this will mean that you have to leave lawless systems too. Where does this leave you? Either you can go to a Vandal occupied system and hope for the best, or you can go to a system that's not settled and thus has no one to maintain reputation with. Either way, getting food, fuel, or regeneration will be extremely difficult. This, however, does bring some questions. For example, how is insurance going to work for people outside the law? I can't imagine an insurance company replacing a ship for someone who is a wanted criminal, or a shipyard delivering to a lawless system. How is this going to affect LTI? I am very curious to see how CAG deals with this, as it's a pretty relevant issue with the game. I suppose that lawless systems could have some kind of a ship broker that supplies players with ships that were stolen. Though again, I am not sure how that works with insurance. And with that being said, that's all for today. What do you think? How should the game deal with murder hobos? Is the PvP solution a good one? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, fly safe, and I will see you in the verse.